What's up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, your home for the 2020 World Series champion Los Angeles Dodgers. I'm joined today by Justin Lorber, our Dodgers farm system expert, lover of the Major League Baseball draft. Justin, I know we're 3.5 weeks away from Christmas in your world, the MLB Draft. I imagine it's an exciting time of year for you.
Yeah, I actually just put out a new quick 5-round mock draft. So for the Dodgers, that's their first 4 picks. I'm just looking at some guys who could be available in that range and an updated big board today as well.
Love it. Love it. Well, I know how excited I get when the NFL draft and mock drafts roll around. So we're going to talk some MLB draft stuff in just a little bit. Before we get into Diego Cartaya, Keibert Ruiz, some guys who have moved in the early minor league system, some off-the-radar guys who have become on-the-radar guys, I'd love to just get your perspective on the Dodger organization as a whole. The Dodgers are, as we record this, 41-27. They have the second best record in the National League. It's been sort of a roller coaster, but for you, when you step back, I'm curious, how are you feeling about where the Dodgers are at, where they stand right now?
I think you have to feel pretty good with where they're at right now. Even, despite all the injuries, they're a game out of first place, a game out of the best record in the National League. And I think if you had told me or told anyone else that in early June, the Dodgers would have already had Albert Pujols, Yoshi Tsutsugo, Nate Jones, Phil Bickford, Steven Souza, and Andy Burns play a role, even a small one like Souza debuting last night. I think you probably would have been surprised and maybe a little bit worried, but given they've done that and they're still, a game out of first place, things have been good.
Yeah, it's a great point. Like, the Dodgers have had to go and basically pick up guys off the trash heap, both offensively and in the bullpen, in order to make it work. And yet here we are, they're still winning 60% of their games. And they're only going to get better from a health perspective, you would hope, from here. So let's dive into the minor league conversation. I know we've got a month or two of sort of sample size with the minor league season after not having any sample size in 2020. So I'll start with what I think my perspective sort of is the headline, which is the 2 Dodger catchers, Diego Cartaya, Keibert Ruiz. I've got some numbers here, and then I'd love to hear your perspective. Cartaya, 54 at-bats so far, 6 home runs, OPS of almost 1.2. He's an A-ball, but remember, we're talking about a 19-year-old. Keibert Ruiz, 22-year-old, who did get 7 at-bats at the major league level, does have a home run this year. In the minors, OPS over 1,000, 8 home runs, 9 doubles, and 82 at-bats. Now, the last time preseason you had Ruiz as the number 2 prospect in the system, Cartaya number 7. I guess I can frame it this way. Are you surprised by anything you've seen from these 2 guys so far?
I think maybe not surprised, but, pleasantly surprised. At least when it comes to Ruiz, the power he's shown. He's never really been able to get to that. He's always been an elite contact hitter, great strikeout to walk numbers, but hasn't really consistently driven the ball like he has this year. And, AAA plays with the major league ball, I think, still. So this isn't the happy fun ball that we saw in 2019 in AAA. This is, the normal ball, and he has 8 home runs this year already, like 22 games. His career high over the course of the season is 12. And they've been playing for a month. He does have the homer and 7 at-bats at the major league, so he has 9 total. He's never been driving the ball like this with authority. His homer a couple nights ago was driven into the upper deck. He's been pulling the ball for power, and I think that adds a lot to his profile with the defense, with the contact skills, because he's still striking out like a 13% rate, which is really good for anybody. Yeah. But when you consider he's a 22-year-old catcher at AAA, really impressive.
Now, I mean, I know there's been a lot of talk. If you ask Dodger fans, any mock trade they're going to invent probably involves Ruiz, because he's a top 100 prospect, one of the Dodgers' top prospects, but at a position where you have Will Smith, who's arguably one of the best 5 catchers at the major league level already and just a few years older. So has Ruiz done anything in your mind to sort of pull him out of that conversation, to say, like, I think one of the things is, like, he doesn't have a future as a catcher at the major league level for the Dodgers because of Will Smith, unless one of those 2 guys would probably have to move or at least add some positional versatility. Like, has Ruiz gotten to a point offensively where that kind of discussion actually makes some sense? Or in your mind, is his value to the organization still potentially as a trade chip?
I think that conversation is the same as it's always been. It's certainly good that he's starting to show off his power, and that'll add value if he plays for the Dodgers or if he ends up getting used as a trade chip. But I wrote about this a couple of years ago at the 2019 deadline about trading Ruiz because of Smith's breakout. And I wrote about the 2017 Dodgers who had Yasmani Grandal and Austin Barnes, who on a per at bat basis in 2017 were two of the top 5 catchers in baseball. Both were very strong defensively. And catchers, they don't play every day. They're not like other position players. And if you can roll out, a top 15, 20 catcher in baseball every night, if you have 2 of those guys, that's going to be a really big advantage, because every team in baseball is not starting their catcher for 160, 150, even maybe 140 games. So when you can have a guy, in that range every single day, it's a big advantage. So I think just because Will Smith is a great catcher, under team control for another 4 or 5 years, that doesn't mean that they should trade Ruiz, because we're also expecting the universal DH to come next year in the new collective bargaining agreement. If they manage to come to a new collective bargaining agreement, that's kind of up in the air. So I don't think that Ruiz needs to be a trade chip. I think, there's certainly a scenario where you can get both of them playing time. You can get both of them spots at the DH. Maybe Ruiz starts playing first base. Will Smith, we know, can play third, played a little bit of second in the minor leagues, but when he wasn't playing catcher, usually third. So there's areas to get them at bats if Ruiz does end up staying.
Well, and the other piece of this conversation is the guy we mentioned, Cartaya. Part of the other reason that Ruiz has always been believed by the average fan, I would say, as a trade chip, is the presence of a guy who's 3 years younger than him, who many seem to believe has an even higher ceiling and is already tapping into that. Again, I know he's at A-ball, but a 1.2 OPS with 6 home runs and 54 at-bats for a 19-year-old is insane. Not to mention, by the way, he plays catcher. So what do you make of how Cartaya has been, and where does he fall in this sort of organizational depth chart?
I mean, thus far, he has lived up to the hype. He was one of the top players in his international signing class, maybe the top player, depending on who you ask. In his first professional season, he made it to Arizona and more than held his own. And now, in his first shot at A-ball, has been Rancho's best hitter over the last 2 weeks. So what he's doing now, he is living up to the hype. He's doing more than living up to the hype. But like you said, he's 19 years old. He's still an A-ball. He's 3 levels from the major leagues, and catching prospects are volatile, even the really good ones. Ruiz, was hitting just as good when he was a teenager in Rancho several years ago, kind of stalled at Double-A, and I think that's what's kind of caused this sense of prospect fatigue with him, I think, among Dodger fans who are kind of sensing that his value has dropped and might want to trade him before his value drops too much. But Ruiz is still 22. He's still hitting well. Cartaya, maybe he follows a similar path, maybe he doesn't. But the Dodgers are loading a catcher. I think if you were to pick any organization and take their catchers, including Austin Barnes, who is, about an average offensive hitter this year, great defensively. We know the pitchers like working with him. I don't see a scenario where you wouldn't want to take the Dodgers catchers over any other team.
Yeah, it's totally fair. It's totally fair. Well, beyond Ruiz and Cartaya, one of the things I asked sort of as we were prepping to get together was, who are some guys, maybe 5 names who have been quote-unquote movers thus far? Then we'll get into some names from off the radar to on the radar. But if we're looking at top 30 to 40 type prospects in your preseason rankings, who are some of those guys who have made a move, who have changed their perception maybe to some degree, either positive or negative?
Sure. So let's start with a couple of Double-A pitchers, Andre Jackson and John Rooney. Andre Jackson, a lot of people might know, was added to the 40-man roster over the offseason. He's a converted position player. When he was drafted in the 12th round back in 2017, he had Tommy John immediately, so he didn't pitch for like a year. And he has really come on, really become more of a pitcher. Every year he's been in the organization, strikeouts have went up and walks have went down. And that's big for a guy with his pure stuff. His changeup has looked really good. His curveballs look good. And he's got a mid-90s fastball. I think he has been, with Josiah Gray out, the most complete starter in the Dodgers organization so far. And I think, and I know we talked about this a little bit before the show, if the Dodgers end up needing another starter, he's someone who is on the 40-man roster who, probably isn't coming up to give them 5 and 6 inning starts, but can come in and give you 3 or 4 innings at a time. So John Rooney is a 2018 third rounder. He's a big lefty. And another guy who strikeouts are way up. And unlike Andre Jackson, he was never a big strikeout guy throughout his career in the minors so far. He's been striking out a ton of guys recently. He's at a velo uptick, which I believe occurred during the shutdown. Been getting a ton of swings and misses on his slider. And so he's a guy who, third rounder, kind of shifted from the radar a little bit, but putting himself back on with how he's been pitching for Tulsa this year. Moving on, Carlos Duran, who is a big 19-year-old pitching in Rancho. He is 6'7", I think like 235.
Not mine.
And so, yeah, big kid. He's always been a big kid. And as Rancho's youngest pitcher, he has 27 strikeouts in his last 14 to third innings over his last 4 appearances. He's been maybe their best starting pitcher this year as the youngest pitcher on the team. Really impressive. So a ways to go, but very promising arm. Has been striking out a ton of guys down in low A. Also at Rancho has been Yorbit Vivas, who, very small, diminutive second baseman. I believe before this season, he was listed at 5'10", 145. He's now listed at 5'10", 170, so he's added some weight. And he was always a plus hit tool guy before. Now he has 6 homers, which is tied for the lead in Rancho. Wow. Maybe if Diego Cartaya is playing there the whole season, he's in the lead. But right now, there's a 4-way tie in Rancho for the lead in homers. And Yorbit Vivas, who was not considered a power hitter at all, has 6 homers and is tied for the lead over the first month.
Wow.
And I'll end here with a bit of a cheat. I'm going to group 3 guys together. Andy Pages, Leonel Valera, and the recently promoted Miguel Vargas. That trio had all been at Great Lakes until Miguel Vargas got promoted just yesterday. And those 3 have really been Great Lakes' best hitters over the course of the season. Andy Pages, the youngest regular in that lineup. We heard about him a lot in the offseason. He was almost traded around a year ago to the Angels in that Jock Peterson-Ross Stripling trade. Thankfully, he wasn't, because he currently leads all Dodger prospects in homers with 10. Walk to strikeout numbers are really good. Has a great arm in right field, probably profiles there, but still might be able to play a little bit of center for the next couple of years. Miguel Vargas always had a strong hit tool, never really drove the ball for power, had a career 9 home runs entering this year. This year, he already has 7. Wow. So he's been driving the ball. He's been getting to his power, which is huge for him because he is a corner infielder. And typically, you don't like those guys to have less than 10 homers a year. And he had 9 over the course of his entire career. So very impressive what he's doing. And Leonel Valera was someone who we heard about in the offseason, added some strength. He's a shortstop, but he's been driving the ball to all fields with power. He has 7 home runs, and he's striking out a lot, but still a young guy. The power add is really, really nice there for him.
It's such a fascinating conversation because we're talking about, 50 to 100 at-bats for these guys, and yet we had no last season. Like, all of these guys, we don't have anything on them dating back until 2019. So when you talk about a guy, he tapped into power, like, it might sound crazy to think a guy goes from 9 home runs career to 7 in 100 at-bats, but you're like, well, he's almost 2 years older than the last time we were. So, obviously these guys weren't playing actual games, but they were getting coached, some of them, I guess, depending on alternate site or not alternate site, but they were developing, you would think, at some level. And so it is interesting to see what might seem like radical changes. But when you're talking about young people and you're talking about 18 months, I would imagine that's not that crazy. So along the same lines, those are guys that are maybe top 30 to 40 people that if folks are following your stuff, if they're just keeping loose tabs on the Dodger organization, I would say about half of those names are probably familiar to them. Who are some other folks who nobody knew about, like nobody outside of you were thinking about or talking about heading into this season who might be creeping into that top 30, top 40 if they can kind of stay on the same trajectory that they're on so far this year?
So the first guy I'll cover here is probably the most notable, Cameron Gibbons. He's a 25-year-old, 6'8" righty from Australia. In his first year with the Dodgers, it seemed like he was just striking out everybody he faced. I think his strikeout percentage was around 40 or 45% at Rancho to start the year. Got a very quick promotion to high A, where he's been pitching to high leverage for them, getting a ton of strikeouts as well. Has a fastball as a breaking ball. Both have been getting a ton of misses. And he is someone who has put himself on the radar, maybe not as a top 30, 40 guy yet because he's now a reliever only, but a potential key relief prospect who could be a quick mover given his age. Yeah. If he keeps pitching well, I don't think they'd have a problem with moving him up to Double A and jumping him 2 levels in one season because of his age. On a similar note, another reliever who's a couple levels above him is Justin Bruihl. He is a lefty. I think he's 23. He was undrafted, but he has gotten himself to AAA and pitched really, really well this year. 26 strikeouts, 3 walks in 18 to 30 innings. That's combined between AA and AAA. But hasn't been giving up a ton of runs, not a ton of hits, low to mid 90s fastball. So if the Dodgers end up needing another lefty, if Derek Clevenger, Alex Vesia aren't working out, if David Price or Victor Gonzalez happen to get hurt, hopefully not, fingers crossed. He could be a guy who could be in line to potentially be added to the 40-man and get a shot at the major league level with how he's pitched this year. And then one more hitter, Johnny DeLuca, who was a 25th rounder in 2019 out of Oregon, but he was a draft-eligible sophomore, so a little bit younger. I know you probably like hearing an Oregon
Ducks,
guy.
baby, go Ducks. Tell me more.
He's been hitting for power, 6 home runs, also tied for the lead in Rancho. 11 stolen bases, great strikeout to walk numbers. Strikeout rate is under 20%, walk rate is above 14%. So someone who's been putting up really good at bats, driving the ball, athletic. He's 22, he turns 23, I believe, next month. So he is a little bit older for that league, but he's someone who could very soon get a promotion to high A.
I wish I could tell you I was a huge University of Oregon baseball fan and that I followed. I keep track on some of the guys that are like the major league level players. I was not familiar with Johnny DeLuca, but shout out to him. Great, comes from a great place. So credit to him. Well, one thing I want to ask, and then we'll close with the draft. This is a question I was chatting with you about before we hopped on, and you mentioned the relief pitcher at AAA. My perception of the system as I've tracked through this year is, and I would say this is kind of unique compared to past years. There feels like the Dodgers have this unbelievable wave of prospects coming through the system, but it does feel like there's like a 1-year gap between when those guys are going to be ready. Like when we talk about most of these names, it feels like Josiah Gray, at least a year away. Andre Jackson, maybe a year away. Those types of things. Aside from Keibert Ruiz, it's a bunch of guys who it feels like are 2022 contributors rather than 2021. So I guess what I wanted to ask you is, A, is that a fair assessment of the system? And B, if not, are there some names of, when we talk about Dodgers adding guys at the deadline, one of the things the Dodgers have always done well is added internally. Like, is Ryan Pepio, could he become a bullpen piece in the stretch run this year? Even guys like Clayton Beeter, Bobby Miller, Josiah Gray, like some of the higher end prospects who are a ways away. Like, are there any hitters or arms that could be late season additions to the Dodgers? Or is my assessment of, hey, most of the guys we're talking about are a year away, is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a fair assessment because if you look at the talent right now that's been grouped up at AA and at high A, Michael Busch, Andre Jackson, Ryan Pepio, Andy Pages, Miguel Vargas, just promoted, Bobby Miller, Clayton Beeter, Landon Knack. There are a ton of guys right now at high A and AA. That's really where the strength of the Dodgers system has been this year. So I think you're right where most of those guys are a year or two away. But someone like Ryan Pepio, who has a great fastball and changeup combination, high velocity, changeup gets a lot of swings and misses. I think he could be someone who, if you need a reliever or if you just think that he's good enough to be in this bullpen, could get a September audition as a bullpen piece. Now, he's in AA right now. I think, first he's got to go through AAA. They're not just going to promote him out of nowhere from AA. But he is someone who I think out of all of those guys that you mentioned might have a shot at potentially contributing to the bullpen.
And Andre Jackson's the other guy you mentioned where if the Dodgers, because one of the things Daniel and I talked about on a show we recorded earlier is a guy like Julio Urias is already setting a career high for innings. So Tony Gonsolin is there taking Dustin May's spot. David Price and Jimmy Nelson seem destined to just be bullpen guys. So if the Dodgers did need a starter, and again, maybe not a 6 innings every time out starter, Josiah Gray was going to make a spot start, got hurt, wasn't able to make it. Is Andre Jackson, like, would he be the guy that you would plug in as sort of the spot starter, number 6 starter? Or do you like Uceda, Gerardo Carrillo? We haven't seen. He's on the 40-man roster. Where would you go if the Dodgers did need a 6th starter for 2 or 3 turns in the rotation at some point this year?
I think Uceda probably gets the first shot because he's at AAA right now. He's already had major league innings. But I like Andre Jackson. I think he's a guy who could come up and give them 3 or 4 innings if needed. If you want to go internally, those are the 2 guys. And no disrespect to Andy Burns and Steven Souza, but those guys probably aren't contributing on a long-term basis to the Dodgers, for the next couple years, and they might not even, make it to the end of
Yeah.
the year. So if you have a guy externally that you want to bring in, if you need someone to pick up innings, I don't think it'd be too hard to find a guy to remove from the 40-man. And again, no disrespect to them, but I think that's just where they are with the situation. The Dodgers have a lot of bats on the 40-man roster currently in AAA. And, while the gap between Steven Souza and DJ Peters right now in terms of major league performance might be a little big, if everyone's healthy, probably neither of those guys is going to be on a postseason roster.
Yeah. I love that you're taking Daniel's favorite phrase, which is no disrespect to these people. I always make fun of Daniel because he's like, not no disrespect to this person, but let me say something insulting. You were far kinder. You were not as insulting as Daniel is, so credit to you. But yeah, I mean, and we were talking even more. Like Scott Alexander's due back in a few weeks. He's going to need to rejoin the 40-man roster. He's on the 60-day IL. Corey Knebel, it sounds like August. So, the 40-man roster crunch is going to get tight. And so when it comes to guys like Uceda, Carrillo, like it feels like the Dodgers are going to have to make a decision of if they do want to bring somebody up who's not on the 40-man, they're going to have to figure out what they think long-term about some of the younger guys who are on the back end of the 40-man who, I mean, some guys we haven't even seen yet. So, well, I appreciate your time. Let me get you out of here with this and take as much time. We're not in a rush. Major League Baseball draft. We're 3.5 weeks away. As I said, the Dodgers, you pointed out, have 4 picks in the first 5 rounds. The Major League Draft, for those that are unfamiliar, is fascinating because there is so much buzz. Like, there is so much negotiating that has to happen before the draft on if we draft you at this number. So more than any other league's draft, it feels like even middle to late first round, there is a pretty decent sense a lot of years of who some teams are connected to. So you are reading all this stuff. You're keeping up to tabs. What do Dodger fans need to know in the leading up to the draft? What are you hearing? Who are some of the guys' names to keep an eye on?
So, we will continue to hear more as, we get closer and closer. The main guy who's been connected to the Dodgers right now is Louisiana high school infielder Peyton Stovall. He's currently a shortstop, but most evaluators do not project him to stay there, probably moves over to second base. Really good hitter, is an offensive first profile. It might remind some people of a guy like Michael Busch. So the Dodgers have definitely been connected to him. We've heard that a lot, and I can confirm that as well. Other than that, there haven't been a whole lot of connections. We heard they were at a Chase Petty start, but if you are inclined to believe FanGraphs' latest mock draft, which I am, they said that teams in the back end of the first round are not expecting him to get there. Shorter high school guy, but really just kind of athletic delivery, kind of violent, but when you're throwing the ball 102 as an 18-year-old, that kind of comes with the territory. So again, not a whole lot of connections yet. I have my guys that I'm interested in. That'll change and that'll adjust as we get closer to the draft and we hear more about what teams think of how these guys have performed over the course of the season, both high school and college.
Now, Stovall, who you mentioned, is that somebody that is potentially still going to be around when the Dodgers are picking?
Yeah, I think his range, if he's affordable, if he is willing to negotiate and not fulfill his commitment to Arkansas, I think he's probably a guy in the 20 to 40 range right now, maybe even a little bit early.
And then just for the sake of the show, who are some of the guys? I know you've got something. Check out futuredodgers.com because he's got all the latest stuff there. But who are some of the other guys that maybe you like? There isn't an obvious connection to the Dodgers, at least not yet. But when the Dodgers are on the clock in the first round, maybe even into the second round, that you're a fan of.
So someone who I just added to my bid board, and he's actually the first round pick in the mock I just put out, is East Carolina right-hander Gavin Williams. And I think you can probably compare him a little bit if the Dodgers were to pick him to the Bobby Miller pick last year. So Williams is a little bit older. He was draft eligible last year as a junior, didn't get taken, went back to school. And he was seen last year as, this big 6'6" righty, upper 90s to triple-digit fastball, but probably a reliever because that's kind of all he has right now. Control is iffy. Like Bobby Miller did last year over only 4 starts. We didn't get to see him do that the entire year. Williams went back to school, really kind of showed that he has the stuff to start, secondary stuff improved, control improved. He's commanding his fastball on the top of the zone. He had a duel with Kumar Rocker, who is probably going to go in the top 10 picks against Vanderbilt last weekend. And he looked really, really impressive. East Carolina ended up losing. They lost the series. but he looked really good. He has pushed himself into that, mid to late first round range, that kind of discussion. And I think he's someone who would fit with what the Dodgers do.
Awesome. Well, it's exciting. We're definitely going to be chatting with you in the coming weeks. And I loved last year we were able to do sort of a day 1 draft recap and day 2 draft recap, I believe, as well. So we'll definitely put that on the agenda. Justin, I appreciate your time. As always, folks, if you're just tuning in, check out Future Dodgers on Twitter. He's got a new article posted at futuredodgers.com as well, with some thoughts on the farm system and draft notes and that kind of thing. So, Justin, we appreciate your time as always. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Jeff.
The best team holding a trophy high in the air. The Los Angeles Dodgers, champions of the baseball world.